I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome back, everybody. We are returning to our historical timeline after the last two episodes with historian Chris Smith on the topic of Native American and Mormon relations. There's always a challenge with this show, a balance that I work to strike every week. You see, this is a serial Mormon history podcast. I try to deal with issues chronologically, but maybe some of you have noticed this. For quite a bit of our Nauvoo episodes, I've had to deal with issues topically as they arise, which requires kind of bouncing around the timeline a little bit. No other topic in Nauvoo history requires a topical treatment as opposed to chronological than Mormon politics and polygamy, which is what we're going to be discussing today. You see, politics of the 1840s were interesting, right? If we consider our political sphere complex today, always keep in mind that it's always been perceived as just complex and chaotic to people who are living at the time, right? You know, politics is up in our faces today with the 24-hour news cycle and social media and Twitter. But even in the absence of those tools, politics has always been the dog-eat-dog kind of world that we see today, just operating further out of the view of the public eye. Now, there may be a case to be made that by percentage, more people are aware of and engaged in politics today than at any other time in American history, but that's largely been a result of the accessibility and ubiquity of these social issues continually bombarding us right in the face every waking moment. The availability of information has probably shifted more people to focus on politics, but while the complexity and games that we see every day in politics has always been present, the public's knowledge of those games hasn't been. When it came to the 1800s, the people who were privy to what was going on in politics were those who actively paid attention, and it required work. There wasn't the level of political osmosis that we experience today. Politics in the 1800s was an elite's game, right? Andrew Jackson was really the first president to actually make his way from a populist platform appealing to the everyday average Joes for votes. But Jackson's presidency was over in 1837, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, was back to the elites being in control of the presidency. Now, the Whigs made a comeback with populist non-politician William Henry Harrison, the so-called hero of Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He's one of the many people who claim to be the guy who killed Tecumseh. But William Henry Harrison died a month into his presidency, and his vice president, John Tyler, was once again a member of the widely reviled Washington elite to take the throne of the presidency. The Whig Party had been losing a lot of power in the late 1830s and early 1840s, and Tyler's inheriting the presidency from Harrison marked one of the final death throes of the Whig Party, as typically Whig voters really became disenchanted by the party's lackluster performance in the 1840s. An issue that does seem to divide 19th century politics from our current political sphere is the declaration of voters. And what I mean by that is today people typically designate themselves as either Republican or Democrat, right? And they use those labels to largely summarize their personal perspective of many common social issues. In the 19th century, it was far more common for people to be issue voters instead of party line voters. So Americans would vote for an issue based on how it impacted them directly, and much less out of loyalty to one of the two political parties that were in power. This meant that political platforms from two different politicians of the same party could be wildly different, and campaign pamphlets would often incorporate rhetoric and buzzwords from both parties, which would be like seeing Elizabeth Warren today running on a pro-choice, anti-abortion platform. It's kind of hard to understand 18th and 19th century politics through our presentist lens, but suffice it to say, parties adapted and evolved with cultural mores as opposed to political parties shaping cultural mores, as seems to be the case today. Well, Joseph Smith and the Mormons had an increasing involvement in politics as Joe's ministry matured. When Joe first declared himself a prophet of God and published his Book of Mormon, there aren't really any extant political declarations from his early ministry. As the Mormon sect continued to grow, he waxed political, and his varied interests became even more diverse. The first trouble the Mormons really ran into was in Missouri, when citizens of Jackson County sought to remove the Mormons to counties north of Jackson. However, even at this time, Joe didn't spend much time working with politicians in Missouri to secure safety for his parishioners. That duty fell to the Whitmers, William Wines Phelps, Frederick G. Williams, and a few other Mormon elites. Joe stayed largely disconnected from the politics of this issue, which arguably was for the better, because when he did get involved, he just marched 200 of his bros out there with their guns and bowie knives, and that all ended in a dozen of them dying from cholera and no armed conflict. And the Fishing River revelation, where he just kind of gave up on the whole campaign. But after that, after this entire expulsion of the Saints out of Jackson County, one of Joe's early political movements was to get the Kirtland Safety Society approved by the Ohio State Legislature. I mean, Joe wanted, he tried to form a bank to deal with tens of thousands of dollars of outstanding debt. So Joe sent Orson Hyde, or Orson Lahaidem, as we call him, because of, his later mission to the Holy Land. So he sent Orson Hyde to the Ohio State Legislature to procure the Kirtland Safety Society's bank charter. Hyde couldn't get any sponsors, so Hyde returned to Kirtland to acquire signatures of non-Mormons who could vouch for the formation of the Mormon Bank. Orson Lahaidem returned to the Ohio State Legislature and was able to gain a few sponsors for the charter, which was then incorporated into a larger spending bill to be passed early that year of 1837. But that bill was defeated, and the Kirtland Safety Society was not approved for a banking charter, which made it illegal for the Kirtland Safety Society to issue banknotes. So as a perfect analogy for Joe's conduct moving forward, he simply told his boys to change the printing plates to anti-banking society and print the money anyways. This foray into politics was wholly unsuccessful, and Joe simply decided to circumvent the entire political and legal system when he couldn't bend Ohio laws and politics to his will. For Joe's personal first real foray into politics and the elite sphere surrounding it, the theater of our focus shifts to Missouri in 1838. Joe had so many legal troubles in Ohio that he was forced to flee the state and take refuge in the Mormon settlements in Caldwell and Daviess counties. The Mormons had always been perceived as an imposition by Missourians. Now, with their headquarters recently moved to Missouri, tensions began to rise. Joe began active campaigns to get Mormons elected to government offices. He frequently exchanged letters with members of the Missouri government, including Governor Boggs himself, all while creating his own Mormon theocracy in the shadows with his own Mormon military and underground enforcement squad. That's kind of a bit of a foray into politics and law, isn't it? After everything boiled over in Missouri, Joe found himself among dozens of his fellow Mormon elites locked up in state jails. The Mormons eventually had to shift tactics when it came to politics. No longer could they impose themselves upon the system. Instead, they opted to work within the system to curry the favor they required to make a permanent settlement in Illinois. This renewed earnest foray into politics with seeming good faith was well received by Illinois politicians, including John C. Reckitt Bennett and Governor Thomas Carlin. Upon Joe's escape from Liberty Jail, he sought to build the necessary relationships with people in power. Those relationships were forged through a lot of work and help of John C. Reckitt Bennett. But these new political movements also shaped Nauvoo society in many ways, which we'll attempt to explore in this and in previous and coming episodes. At the heart of Joe's actions lay the single motivation of self-interest, right, which regularly manifested in him doing what he perceived as best for the Mormons, but there was always the self-interest motivation at the core of everything he did. When it came to elections, Joe was only motivated to vote for who could provide the Mormons with the most religious liberty. The Mormon voting bloc was up for sale to any politician who would stroke the ego of and make the grandest promises to the one true prophet. This also caused some tensions in the membership who viewed Joe solely as their prophet and religious leader, right? Joe had to strike a balance with these people that his politics were done in service of forwarding the kingdom of God, which could be a hard sell to the more skeptical of his followers. Historian Timothy L. Wood published an article in the Journal of Illinois State Historical Society back in 2000. This is volume 93, number 2, in which he summarizes this tension of prophet as well as political leader very aptly. Quote, "The relationship between religious and secular authority during the early days of Mormon movement was quite paradoxical. Although Mormonism came into being during a time of heightened democratic awareness in the United States, it quickly developed many authoritarian tendencies. According to Thomas F. O'Dea, as Mormonism developed a coherent church polity during the 1830s, a potentially unstable dichotomy emerged. On one side was the impulse toward congregationalism that so many of the New England saints had been steeped in, which emphasized the authority and participation of the general membership. On the other hand, to avoid schism, the church needed to contain religious charisma and innovation within the office of prophet-president. To maintain any kind of unity of purpose, Smith alone had to be seen as the sole source of direction for the Restoration movement. The resulting system has been characterized as a willingly designated absolutism. End quote. Further in the article, Wood cites historian O'Dea again, saying, quote, "What had developed was a democracy of participation and an oligarchy of decision-making and command. Thus, Mormon authoritarianism drew its leaders from the ranks, and the ranks supported such leaders." End quote. And now from later in the article, to realize everything, all of these threads that are proposed by the article, quote, "This principle suggests a paradox in the Mormon attitude concerning the relationship between religion and power. Within the church and the immediate community, Mormons tended to favor an authoritarian style of leadership, which enforced doctrinal conformity and defended such peculiar LDS social institutions as secret temple rituals and, eventually, polygamy. On the other hand, the constitutional theory articulated by Smith and his followers steadfastly advocated the principles of religious liberty and governmental non-interference with the religious lives of its citizens." Religious liberty! You gotta love that phrase. Seen in that light, the Mormons demanded traits in their leaders at the state and national level that would have seemed quite distasteful to them if possessed by authority figures closer to home. End quote. So, just like Mormons today, small government that allows religious liberty. But if Mormons are controlling the government, then we're totally okay with a big government because that's just one step towards building Zion. It wasn't until Nauvoo where this described phenomenon and paradoxical situations really became the status quo, although the roots trace back to the early Kirtland era. It's how the church operates today, although by a much more streamlined algorithm, right? Power is vested in the highest echelon of members who are lifelong devotees, while the average membership sees their role as crucial in the theodemocracy of voting to sustain leaders every conference. And to inspire that loyalty, the leadership draws from the lower ranks to fill the middle management, which inspires every member to eventually aspire to the higher echelons, even if that may never be even a remote possibility. This was how the church operated itself in Nauvoo, and it was how politics in the city worked as well. Joe did his best to keep only the most loyal followers close to him, which were all pulled from the lower and middle ranks of the church, granted promotions upon expressions of fealty, of course. People like Reckitt Bennett had to buy their way into the highest ranks with offerings of nearly unlimited political power like Bennett did, a promise on which he delivered. For his efforts, Reckitt Bennett gained access to the deepest and darkest secrets of the Nauvoo kingdom. He became bearer of Joe's most explosive secrets. We'll get back to Bennett in a minute here, but let's spend a second talking about Nauvoo from an economic perspective for just a little while here. To understand Nauvoo economics and politics, a further contextual understanding of broader Illinois economics is required. This is from Robert Flanders' Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi, page 167, quote, "General economic conditions in the state were at that time near a state of collapse. The whole country had remained depressed following 1839, and in Illinois the chronic fiscal crisis stemming from the enormous state debt incurred by the plan of works had further hindered recovery. Public and private credit had long been strained, and early in 1842 the Bank of Illinois at Shawneetown and the Illinois State Bank at Springfield failed. With the collapse of the two largest banks, financial ruin spread throughout the state. What commerce there was on a near barter basis." End quote. This financial strain was hitting the Mormons, and Joe hard by the late 1843, where our historical timeline currently resides. Dozens of city projects had been conceived, initially financed, and had yet to be completed to return on the investment, or they had just failed outright. Joe was personally hundreds of thousands in debt for land contracts that he had signed to get the Mormons their own land. He wasn't paying bills on the land contracted for, so the deed holders were unable to pay land taxes, making them even more insistent on Joe to repay even the smallest portion of his debts. The canal project was said to bring in a ton of commerce and manufacturing and shipping into the town, but a few feet of the canal were dug and then the project was abandoned. No factories were built. The small amount of mercantile and goods that the Mormons could produce was too costly to ship to a location where they could sell it for the price that the labor commanded. The Nauvoo temple was an absolute black hole of resources that would never produce income the way that the temples do for the church today through membership fees of, 10% of every member's income. The Nauvoo House Project. That was a project created to make the premier inn and tavern in the state of Illinois, but it was so far behind schedule that Joe opted to have a wing added to his own home for visitors of the city to stay in. We could discuss many similar projects, but these examples suffice to illustrate how problematic Nauvoo's economy was. But those were just the economic forces at play at the citywide level. Joe also had mountains of personal notes that he had yet to square away. Another passage from Flanders' book offers a window into Joe's own financial troubles that underpin the entire city's financial problems that were in the broader context of the state of Illinois' financial problems. Quote, "That Halstead and Haynes note was only one of many financial problems trying the prophet just then. Smith was beginning his store business in the winter of 1841 to 42. He managed in March of 1842 to repay William Marks, the Nauvoo stake president, quote, who had loaned money and property to the church at various times." Back to Flanders. Smith recorded with evident satisfaction, quote, "closed a settlement with William Marks and paid him off, principal and interest, to the last farthing for all that myself or the church had of him." The following day, he recorded simply, "settled with Brother Niswanger." But he was unable to retire his obligation to the estate of Oliver Granger. Finally failed to effect anything, he complained. "Gilbert Granger refused to give up the papers to me, which he had received of his father, although I presented him deeds, mortgages, and paper to the amount of some thousands against his father, more than he had against the church." Back to Flanders. It was in March that Smith advised Edward Hunter to bring specie to Nauvoo and offered him the store. The prophet's financial condition was then critical, yet he did not suspend his land buying operations. On March 2nd, he offered a New York land speculator $100 an acre for 20 acres in the city not yet owned by the church, or to take an agency to sell the same. And a month later, he bought the farm for $1,150. End quote. This was all in the lead-up time to Joe and dozens of other Mormon elites all filing for bankruptcy later that year of 1842. Maybe Joe thought that if he vacuumed up enough property that he'd be able to incur enough debts and then file bankruptcy, and then somehow the properties would end up his. Although, I don't know, right? There's no possible way to put our minds in Joe's skull to see what he was really thinking or what his possible long-term plans were for answering all of these debts. Maybe he thought if he overthrew the government, maybe all of these land debts aren't really going to matter at the end of the day. I just don't know. This is the crucial issue here, and I can't stress this enough. Nauvoo wasn't exporting anything. Nauvoo as a city was so painfully insolvent that only disaster loomed in the near future. Chicago is what it is today because at this same time in the 1840s, it was growing at a sustainable rate. It had location on one of the Great Lakes, allowing for importing and exporting by water, which was the largest medium of transit at the time. It had just completed a rail system through the city in the late 1830s, and it was beginning to reap the benefits of that, right? So Chicago was doing good, but Nauvoo could not possibly be modeled after Chicago because of the location. Thomas Ford, elected governor of Illinois in 1842, during a heated election made more intense by the presence of the Mormons, he summarized this period in his 1852 book, History of Illinois. This is from page 232. Quote, "The great plenty of money brought here by the work on the canal and railroads set up a great many merchants all over the country in business. It increased the stocks of goods brought to be sold, created unnatural competition among the merchants to sell, who were forced to sell on a credit or not at all. The people were encouraged to buy on credit, and when their debts became due for the want of money to pay them, they gave their notes to the merchants with 12% interest, which the reader will observe hereafter was the cause of some strange legislation on the collection of debts, and caused the reduction of the rate of interest to 6%. Until the year 1833, there had been no legal limit to the rate of interest to be fixed by contract. But usury had been carried to such an unprecedented degree of extortion and oppression as to cause the legislature to enact severe usury laws, by which all interest above 12% was condemned. It had been no uncommon thing before this to charge 100 and 150%, and sometimes 200 and 300%, but the common rate of interest by contract had been about 50%. End quote. Understandably, Governor Ford's brain would explode at payday lenders today, but this sets the scene for what the Wild West of speculation and note trading was like in Illinois in the 1840s. People were trading notes and bartering because actual gold and silver specie was so hard to come by since the Panic of 1837 and the Specie Circular, which was signed in by Andrew Jackson, which required the government to take only gold and silver for taxes. All of this crushing debt led to an interesting program in 1842 in Nauvoo. Once again, this is from Flanders Kingdom on the Mississippi. Quote, on April 12th, the Quorum of 12 initiated a program of debt forgiveness within the church. Many saints had borrowed from their brethren over a period of years, and the presidency and bishopric had done likewise to relieve the destitute from the Missouri expulsion and to build up Nauvoo. Many of these claims have already been settled, said the apostles. Many have been given up as canceled by those who held them, and many would remain unsettled. Now the 12 urged a general cancellation of all such claims, which have arisen out of the difficulties and calamities of the church, that when the temple is completed, there will be nothing from this source to produce jars and discords, strifes and animosities, so as to prevent the blessings of heaven descending upon us as a people. While things remain as they are, and men remain subject to the temptations of evil as they now are, the day of release and the year of Jubilee cannot be. How are the saints to prosper when the church, the presidency, and the bishops, and those who have sacrificed everything but life for our salvation are thus encumbered? It cannot be. They advise that all such old accounts, notes, bonds, etc. be consecrated to the temple. If they could be negotiated, the proceeds would be advanced to the building. If not, after the temple is finished, we will make a burnt offering of them, which shall bind the brethren together in the bonds of eternal peace and love and union, and you shall rejoice that you have hearkened unto counsel and set our brethren free. End quote. A debt forgiveness program in Nauvoo in 1842 that would only seem to benefit the elite who had borrowed themselves so deep into a hole that even bankruptcy couldn't suffice to answer the cloud of debt over their heads. Eventually, if you're so far in debt, it feels like a burnt offering of all your debts would be a good idea, but that's not how economics work. You can't just blow up the credit card buildings and expect that everybody's debt is wiped out. You see, this is the micro level of individuals owing each other hundreds or thousands of dollars, and the city itself was only a more extreme version of this perpetual poverty being shrouded by this tangled line of credit web that Nauvoo elites had weaved for themselves and for the Mormons at large. Nauvoo simply had no material exports and was importing goods at an alarming rate, all on credit. Nauvoo's chief export was debt. Loans and creditors were swallowing the kingdom on the Mississippi, and there was no answer beyond just holding out and waiting and hoping that some savior comes along. Just hold out till we finish the Nauvoo house. Just hold out until a rich guy comes and builds a factory here. Just hold out a little longer. But the house was never built, and the rich men never came. But that didn't stop the rich and powerful men from visiting the Mormon theocracy. In fact, for all of the troubles that the Mormons were experiencing, they could still put on a hell of a show when a visiting dignitary would make their way to the city. You know, holidays and festivals and annual 4th of July parades with the Nauvoo Legion and full battle regalia and skirmishes and grand parties. All of these things became wildly popular events for wealthy people to attend, wealthy Gentiles. The prophet, Joseph Smith, was quite the entertainer. The number of house parties that he held in the Nauvoo mansion and other public areas throughout 1841 through 44 are truly remarkable, most of which were catered and attended to by his many beautiful young wives. If Chicago was the industrious Mexico City, Nauvoo was the Cabo. That's where tourists go. The Mormon Kingdom is where rich people in Illinois went to party and rub elbows with other prominent politicians. Now, Joe wasn't a politician, but he held a ton of political power with the Mormon voting bloc, and thus attracted a ton of powerful people to the kingdom. He also installed the Masonic Lodge just a year and a half prior to where our timeline resides in late 1843, and plenty of politicians at the time were Masons, making Nauvoo an even more enticing destination for the beautiful 3-story lodge that they had just built. Now, all of this amassing power, all of it came back to the Nauvoo Charter and how it was employed. As Flanders puts it in The Kingdom in the Mississippi, quote, "On its face, the Nauvoo Charter was just another city charter with some novel clauses. In operation, it was a charter to create a Mormon kingdom in the sovereign state of Illinois. Smith conceived Nauvoo to be federated with Illinois somewhat as Illinois was federated with the United States, with strong legal and patriotic ties to be sure, but also with guaranteed immunities and rights of its own." End quote. Given the expansive powers granted by the Nauvoo Legion and the expansive powers realized by the Mormons by 1843, we need to understand the importance for the Nauvoo House. The Nauvoo House was set to become the Mormon Ritz. It was a 5-star hotel with dozens of rooms, staffed by Joe's younger, beautiful wives to take proper care of the wealthy dignitaries who chose to stay a night or two in the city. And all of this leads to a question, right? What do rich and powerful politicians, an elite group of which Joe was steadily becoming a member, what do they want to do when they go on vacation to a beautiful city like Nauvoo, with very little to do when you compare it to a large metropolis like D.C. or New York? Well, the same thing as wealthy politicians do today. Party, right? Party, rub elbows, expensive meals, nice alcohol, all of the possible vice that could satiate their palate. You know, I'm painting with broad brushstrokes here, but it's the 19th century and wealthy white guys are going to do what wealthy white guys are going to do, right? Nauvoo was considered a temperate city because one of the first things that Reckitt Bennett did upon his arrival in the passage of the Nauvoo Charter was to outlaw any alcohol distribution inside city limits, unless it was for medical purposes or with the express written approval of the mayor, John C. Bennett, vice mayor Joseph Smith, or an alderman of the city, which were almost exclusively Mormon elites. So this resulted in alcohol being strictly controlled in the city for the year and a half that Bennett was mayor. But much like Prohibition, alcohol consumption still happened. Joe himself was frequently seen in Nauvoo public gatherings with other powerful men quite smashed. Now, if you'll permit me a bit of a long reading from one of the most overlooked and fun little books in Mormon history, Hearts Made Glad by Lamar Peterson. This is beginning on page 166, and it's just a delightful passage. Please bear with me. Quote, "Biographer Harry M. Beardsley met the question of the prophet's decorum with his rationalization in his Joseph Smith and his Mormon Empire." Now quoting Beardsley, quote, "Officially, Joe was an ardent advocate of temperance, even to the extent of issuing commandments against the use of tea, coffee, and tobacco. In his unofficial capacity, however, he was not above indulging in these dissipations himself. Some Mormon writers attempted to make the prophet a teetotaler, but in the face of testimony of his contemporaries, their efforts fail. Drinking was general among Americans of Joseph Smith's period. Particularly in Missouri and Illinois, consumption of large quantities of whiskey was considered a necessity. The restricted diet of the pioneers, especially the preponderance of salt pork, resulted in numerous digestive ailments. Malaria, too, was common, and whiskey was considered a prime remedy for both troubles. At Kirtland, Joe was apparently circumspect in his drinking, taking his tipple at his own home or at the homes of close friends, and seldom drinking in public or permitting himself to appear intoxicated on the streets. Brother Crazy William Smith felt no such restraint. He was usually drunk on Saturday afternoons and sometimes ascended the pulpit next morning with a perceptible hangover. By the time the Mormons reached Nauvoo, however, Joe's inhibitions had vanished. He patronized his own barroom in the back of his store and the barrooms of Montrose across the river. He was frequently drunk in public, nearly always so on holidays and festive occasions, and he was proud of his capacity for liquor. Beardsley continues his picturesque peroration on some 60 pages later. Quote, at Curland, many of the new arrivals had been bitterly disappointed in the appearance, speech, and actions of the prophet, and many of them apostatized. Joe wanted to guard against this at Nauvoo. One method would have been for him to lead an exemplary life, conforming speech and action to the popular concept of a prophet of God. But this would have robbed the prophet job of all attractions for Joseph Smith, and he realized that should he attempt to conform and then fall into human errors, the effect would be devastating. So Joe adopted a bold course. I am not a perfect man and never profess to be, he reiterated from the pulpit. I have my failings and passions to contend with, the same as the greatest stranger to God has. I am tempted the same way as you, my brethren. I am not infallible. The converts, having heard this from Joe's own lips on Sunday morning, were thus, in a measure, prepared for the extraordinary spectacle they might witness that afternoon. The prophet whooping it up at a horse race on the flats. The prophet stripped to his waist, covered in sweat and dirt, engaged in a wrestling match. The prophet, his hat awry, weaving unsteadily down the street, or being loaded into his carriage by Porter Rockwell and an able-bodied assistant. End quote. I love it. It's not the Joseph Smith we typically picture, the pious, straight-laced, holding his sword in his Nauvoo Legion outfit. No, he liked to party. And in summer of 1843, the Smiths and many of Joe's wives moved into the Nauvoo mansion when the Nauvoo house was so far behind schedule and the city needed a proper place to entertain visitors. In the Nauvoo mansion, Joe had installed a bar, which Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell attended as bartender after his escape from jail and arrival late that same year of 1843. Joe was apparently very proud of the bar room in the Nauvoo mansion, and when Emma confronted him about it, this is what Joe had to say. Quote, he reminded her that all taverns had their bars at which liquor was sold or dispensed, which was true at that day, and again urged that it was only for a time and was being done only for Porter's benefit, explaining that since Porter had been compelled to leave his own home and had, in a measure, been made a scapegoat for charges that had been made against the two of them, he felt obligated to help him. End quote. No, honey, I swear, all of it, that's Port's liquor, even though it's at our house in the bar that I had built in the basement story of it. Besides, people who stay at taverns, they expect to have their alcohol palate satisfied. So it's okay. I promise, Emma. I mean, it's just fascinating. But this same justification was also given by Joe's nephew, Joseph F. Smith, when he was prophet of the Brighamite Church at the Salt Lake City Hotel when it was opened in 1912. This is what Joseph Smith said. Joseph F. Smith, right? Joe's nephew, quote, the people who visit us want something to wet up with, and unless it is provided for them, they'll go somewhere else. End quote. Joseph F. Smith was using the same justification as his own uncle about the Nauvoo mansion bar. It's just an interesting view into Nauvoo, isn't it? What many people would call sin and vice. That was an undertone that gripped Nauvoo, right? But it wasn't just alcohol, because drinking is only part of partying that wealthy guys liked to do in the 1800s. But could be equally applied to nearly all societies for all times in all places, right? We know that a number of brothels operated in the city of Nauvoo, the largest of which of these brothels was owned by Reckitt Bennett, but that brothel was uprooted and tossed into a ravine for unknown reasons in late 1841 or possibly early 1842. The dating on it is a little tough. However, Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willie Smith, he was operating his own little prostitution ring, or spiritual wifery ring, as historians would call it. He had his own smaller brothel on the outskirts of town. But just consider the economic pressures that led to the formation of these brothels, right? Once again, I can't reiterate this enough. This can't be overstated. Nauvoo had no system of major exportation to bring money into town. One of the only ways the money came into Nauvoo was through tourism by wealthy and powerful men who often held government positions or were wealthy business owners. This meant that there weren't any jobs to go around in Nauvoo. That meant that men couldn't provide for their families, and many women who, at the time, women constituted nearly a quarter of factory job force, nationally speaking at this time, women had to resort to other industries to bring money into the family when her husband couldn't find work to keep food on the table. A fascinating article that you'll find in the show notes goes through the economic dynamics of sex work in antebellum America. This was written by Anya Jober, titled Women's Work and Sex Work in 19th Century America. Here's just a little snapshot from it. Quote, "Women in antebellum America had few options for self-support. Throughout the 19th century, domestic service, including cleaning houses, laundering clothing, preparing meals, and caring for children, was by far the most common paid occupation for women. However, because servants were required to live in the households of their employers, receiving most of their pay in the form of room and board, and had limited autonomy, most women preferred other types of wage labor. By 1850, approximately 1/4 of all factory workers were women. Factory work included textile production, i.e. spinning thread and weaving cloth, and making ready-made cloth, i.e. cutting patterns and sewing trousers, increasingly with the use of power machinery. Outside of the factory walls, the needle trades also included finishing clothing, hemming pants, for instance, by hand. None of these occupations offered financial stability, even with regular employment, and many women, especially in the needle trades, frequently found themselves unemployed during economic downturns. Economic necessity and the desire for an easier life drove many women to the sex trade in the decades leading up to the Civil War. In 1859, Dr. William Sanger's study of 2,000 prostitutes confined in New York's Blackwell's Island prison revealed that half of the women had worked as domestic servants before entering the sex trade, and another quarter had worked as seamstresses. Abused and abandoned wives made up the remaining 1/4. According to Sanger's study, 1/4 of the women at Blackwell's Island reported being destitute before entering the sex trade. Their stories revealed the desperate circumstances of working-class women in 19th century America. As the case history of one inmate tersely put it, quote, "No work, no money, and no home," end quote. Although most women clearly regarded sex work as a last resort, 1/4 of women in Dr. Sanger's study claimed to have entered the trade voluntarily. This choice, of course, was shaped by financial considerations. While prostitution was rarely lucrative, a sex worker could earn as much in an hour as a seamstress could in a day. As feminist speaker Caroline Dahl told a Boston audience in 1859, quote, "Lust is a better paymaster than the mill owner or the tailor. Compare the price of labor with the price of dishonor, and you will cease to be surprised that women fall." End quote. This was the harsh economic reality of women in the 19th century and of Nauvoo. And of course, the expected results in creating a fragile edifice of a city built on speculation, debt, bogus and counterfeit money, and fraud. What this eventually created was a system of organization among the sex workers of Nauvoo, some of which were also likely taken as plural wives to Joe and other Mormon elites. Bennett's expose includes an entire chapter on the sex work hierarchy that was created within the confines of Mormon theology, as much as out of economic necessity to bring tourism, and to pull tourism dollars out of the tourists when they get there. This begins on page 217 of the History of the Saints. The chapter is titled The Mormon Seraglio. And, of course, if you are a subscriber on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you get access to the audiobook version of this book with my commentary. It was a long read, but it's all there and it's uploaded if you just search for Namo Book Club on the Patreon page for the show. You know, a little as $1 an episode. You know, that's not so much. It's going to grant you access to the wealth of controversial Mormon history there. Quote, "The Mormon Seraglio is very strictly and systematically organized. It forms a grand lodge, as it were, and is divided into 3 distinct orders or degrees. The first and lowest of these is styled the Cyprian Saints. The second, the Chambered Sisters of Charity, and the third and highest degree is called the Cloistered Saints, or Consecratees of the Cloister." End quote. Bennett breaks down these 3 degrees of Mormon sex workers, attributing the organizational and initiatory aspects to the Relief Society. For the first degree, the Cyprian Saints, a woman is picked out when rumors circulate that she's, quote, "lapsed from the straight path of virtue," end quote, after which she is marked and brought in for a Relief Society inquisition, capital I inquisition. According to Bennett, quote, This body is solemnly organized in secret and select council, and by its members the poor, terrified female is questioned and threatened until she confesses the crime she has committed, or perhaps, in her confusion and terror, accuses herself of what she is never guilty of. She is immediately by the council pronounced a Cyprian, and is excluded from any further connection with the Relief Society. End quote. So, after this inquisition, this prospective Cyprian is cut off from contact with her friends in the Relief Society, and, quote, her name and failing are stealthily promulgated among the trustworthy, now trustworthy is italicized, trustworthy members of the church, at whose command she is for licentious purposes forever after, end quote. That's how a woman goes from nice and wholesome in the Mormon community of Nauvoo to being a target when some unfounded rumor circulates about her chastity. And according to Bennett, it was common that, quote, many young and beautiful females have thus been ruined eternally, end quote. The Cyprian Saints. This was the first degree that began young and beautiful females on the path towards full-on sex slavery in Nauvoo. The next degree sounds much worse, as the women seem to become not only victim, but completely shaped by their new forced profession. Quote, the Chambered Sisters of Charity. This order comprises that class of females who indulge their sensual propensities without restraint, whether married or single, by the express permission of the prophet. Permission or declaration, requirement of the prophet. You'll see the coercion and the grooming process that goes into this. Whenever one of the saints, as the Mormons style themselves, of the male sex becomes enamored of a female, and she responds to the feeling by a reciprocal manifestation, the loving brother goes to Holy Joe and states the case. It makes, by the by, no difference whatever if one or both parties are already provided with conjugal helpmates. The prophet gravely buries his face in his hat, in which lies his peepstone, and inquires of the Lord what are his will and pleasure in the matter. Sometimes, when Joe wants the woman for his own purposes, an unfavorable answer is given, but generally the reply permits the parties to follow the bent of their inclinations, which they do without further ceremony, though with a strict observance of secrecy on account of the Gentiles, who have no right to the blessings and privileges so liberally granted to the Latter-day Saints. Thus, these poor, deluded females, while incited by their very religion, if it deserves that name, to indulgence in the most degrading passions, have their consciences soothed and their scruples appeased by the sanction of the pretended apostle and prophet of the Lord, in whom they have the utmost confidence, and whose lightest word is with them a law. The Chambered Sisters of Charity are much more numerous than the Cyprian Saints. This results naturally from the greater respectability of their order. They are the Saints of the Green Veil, and are by no means niggardly of their favors to any of the faithful. Provided the Holy Joe does not desire to monopolize any of them, they are at the service of each and all of the apostles, high priests, and elders of Israel. End quote. For what interesting purposes might Joe, quote-unquote, monopolize some of these much more numerous Chambered Sisters of Charity? You know, they're at the service of the highest-ranking Mormon elites, all the way down to the lowliest elders of Israel. And I would be willing to bet that their services were provided to Gentiles when the opportunity would arise or the purse was heavy enough. Finally, Recca Bennett gets into the third and final degree, the most favored sisters of the Relief Society. Quote, the consecratees of the cloister, or cloistered saints. This degree is composed of females, whether married or unmarried, who, by an express grant and gift of God, through his prophet the Holy Joe, are set apart and consecrated to the use and benefit of particular individuals as secret, spiritual wives. They are the saints of the Black Veil, and are accounted the special favorites of heaven, and the most honorable among the daughters of Jacob. Their spiritual husbands are all together from the most eminent members of the Mormon Church, and participate in the holiness of their consecrated wives. End quote. Consecrated to the church, and of course to the designs of Joe and the church, just like the property of the Gentiles in Missouri. The analogy makes itself, and the results are understandably similar. There were other logistical constraints beyond merely establishing this grooming structure to grow the pool of possible wives and sex workers, right? And further detail is illuminated by another scathing expose of Joe Smith and the Mormons, this one by Joseph H. Jackson, who Joe sent on a mission to break Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell out of prison. But Jackson was unsuccessful in that. You can go back to previous episodes to learn all about that. Now, Jackson has spent a bit of time in our historical timeline, but he saw enough of what happened in the darkest alleys of Nauvoo to shed further light on this superstructure of hedonism. On page 12 of his expose, which you'll find in the show notes, he describes the scriptural justification for polygamy and how sealings worked. Then he writes this, quote, "Having an explanation of the doctrine, let us see the application. Joe had in his employ certain old women called mothers in Israel, such as Mrs. Taylor and old Madame Durfee, and old Madame Sessions, in whom the people have great confidence. But, in fact, they are the most depraved hypocrites on earth. If Joe wishes to make a spiritual wife of a certain young lady, he would send one of these women to her. The old woman would tell the young lady that she had had a vision in which it was revealed to her that she was to be sealed up to Joe, or his friend, as the case might be, as a spiritual wife, to be his in time and eternity. Soon after this, Joe would appear and tell the lady that the Lord had revealed to him that Mrs. So-and-so had had a vision concerning her, and he had been to see her. Not suspecting any collusion, the young lady would be astonished, and being strong in faith, she could have no doubt but that Joe spoke by authority of God. He would then ply his arguments, and with utmost sanctity speak in the name of the Lord, and say that at such a time and at such a place it had been revealed to him that she should be his or his friend's in time and eternity. If she objected, he would quote his scripture and his revelations, and thus by playing on her superstitious credulity and artfully at the same time inflaming her passions, he seldom failed of his object. Being once successful, he held the fear of exposure over her as a rod to prevent rebellion from his allegiance. This was a specimen of the mode and manner of Joe in carrying his vile measures of seduction. To the truth of what I have here said, there are hundreds who can testify, and I have no doubt would do it if they could be protected from the revenge of the hellish clan, which still exists in Nauvoo. The extent to which this abomination was carried may be imagined from the fact that Joe Smith boasted to me that he, in this manner, from the commencement of his career, had seduced 400 women." End quote. Jackson has more strong words for one of these mothers in Israel, who he called Madame Durfee in that previous screed. Quote, "There are women, however, who should be exposed, such as this Mrs. Durfee. Taking her own confession and Joe's stories as correct, there is not, I believe, such another perfect fiend in human shape on the earth. A more devout, pious, and virtuous being than she apparently is cannot be found in any church, but a more perfect specimen of knavery, villainy, and everything that is detestable in humanity than she in reality is, the union cannot produce." End quote. Women coercing younger women into sex work. Yeah, I mean, that's a thorny issue to deal with. Women coercing younger women into sex work at the direction of a self-proclaimed prophet who stands to gain the younger women as his own personal sex workers to carry out whatever he sees fit. That's even more troubling. These are the structural day-to-day workings of Nauvoo sex working ring. What does this really look like? Once again from Joseph Jackson, quote, "I have from his own mouth, from the mouth of his victims, statements which I dare not reveal, for the world will not believe that such corruption could possibly exist. Yet if protection could be afforded to some of those females who were the victims of these wretches, the leaders of Nauvoo, I could, I believe, from their own mouths, procure confessions that would startle the world. I have visited frequently those women whom Joe supported for the gratification of his lust. I have found them subsisting on the coarsest food, and not daring to utter a word of complaint, for they fear Joe Smith more than they did their God. I have appealed to the finer feelings of their nature, and seen them weep as children, when dwelling on the degraded state to which their credulity had reduced them. Knowing me to be in the confidence of Joe, they hesitated not to unfold their griefs to me. But their neighbors and acquaintances generally know nothing of their feelings or their degradation. These remarks apply only to a portion of the spiritual wives, for there are many who are as corrupt as Joe himself." End quote. So why do we have to rely on strictly antagonistic sources for this information? Is it not trustworthy because there isn't any faithful corroboration of this information? Would we expect to find a faithful member recount any of this information when their life was held in the balance? There's also the legality of this to consider, because polygamy was illegal and sexual slander laws were powerful and carried heavy penalties. As John Dinger notes in his 2018 article, this article is actually nominated for Best Article of JWHA this year, Sexual Slander and Polygamy in Nauvoo. You'll find it in the show notes. Quote, "One of the major problems encountered when studying the beginnings of Mormon polygamy is the lack of contemporaneous historical documentation. This is because of the secret nature of polygamy and the crime of polygamy. Secrecy itself defined and delineated this tragedy. However," George Smith added, "Mormon record keepers faced a dilemma in writing about Nauvoo because they were engaged in illegal bigamous marriages. Another reason for the lack of contemporaneous documents is the existence of sexual slander laws and their criminal and civil use in 19th century Illinois. While legislatures created these laws to protect women's reputations, Joseph and Hiram Smith used them to counter claims against their participation in polygamy or spiritual wifery. Such lawsuits help explain the lack of detail in John C. Bennett's History of the Saints and William and Wilson Law's Nauvoo Expositor. While these laws may have helped to protect polygamists, they challenge historians studying Nauvoo polygamy." End quote. So because of this dearth of available contemporary documentation, antagonistic accounts must be used to contextualize faithful accounts to form a more holistic picture of Nauvoo polygamy. Every historian that I've ever asked about Bennett's claims of this degree of spiritual wives and the Cloistered sisters, the consecratees, so on and so forth, it's all been hand-waved because they just say, "Oh, that's just Bennett being Bennett, whatever." But it holds explanatory power, and it forms a basis of understanding the organizational structure necessary when dozens of Mormon men and possibly dozens of powerful and wealthy Gentile tourists were passing around hundreds of women like a frat party pocket pussy. Right? This is a major problem when we're studying Nauvoo polygamy. Accordingly, historians have had to deal with accusations like this from Bennett and from Jackson, specifically when it comes to the women's complicity in the criminal empire of Nauvoo. Quote, "He spoke of his spiritual wives particularly and called them great captains in his service to carry his design, and remarked that through them he could get any stranger's money. I asked him how he would work the matter, to which he replied that he had only to tell certain of his spiritual wives that such a man had been in the Missouri War, and that he should be put out of the way, and his property and money consecrated to the use of the church. Then, said he, it is damned easy for them to get on his good graces, and to mix a white powder with his victuals, and put him out of the way. I then told him that he ought to give me the names of these women, as they might be of great service to me in carrying his secret measures. He then went on to give me the names of the women, who he said would go to the ends of the earth for him. But I shall not in this place disclose them." End quote. And because of sexual slander laws, the names of these women were never provided, creating a blind spot in the historical record. You see, the casual visitor of Nauvoo ran into the same limitations that historians do today. This was a criminal empire, and operations behind closed doors were never recorded in the first place, let alone the documentation about these operations ever discovered. The real Nauvoo existed in the shadows of the clean streets and the cherry-faced merchants and the casual young man whittling with his bowie knife on the street corner, the beautiful buildings erected in typical industrious Mormon fashion. The real Nauvoo will forever remain enigmatic to those of us who study it from nearly 2 centuries in the future, but that historical blindness is by design of the people who ran the city and the man who sat atop the criminal empire. If Mormons living in Nauvoo for years had no idea of the true face of the city that underlay the mask that covered it, how can we expect to see the face of that demon now? Now, I think that Joseph Jackson is a terrible writer, but this passage in his 1844 expose stands out as exceptional to describe exactly what I'm trying to say, which applies equally to contemporary visitors in the 1840s and to historians of today, especially if those historians believe the pious prophet apologist narrative of this vile degenerate of a human being. A stranger who visits Nauvoo can form no idea of the corruption practiced in the city. To him, everything appears perfectly quiet and harmonious, and he is favorably impressed, and hence sets down all that he hears against the Mormons as originating in religious intolerance. Nay, a man may live for years in this place and know but little of its iniquities. So completely does Joe cover up his crime. Many who were disposed to tell what they knew were deterred and are still deterred by the fear of the power of Joe and the secret clan about him. When anything of a disgraceful character is disclosed, Joe, ever ready to prove a negative, will bring together his clan and prove himself perfectly innocent. And thus, no matter how vile his conduct in private, the individual who ventures to disclose it not only runs the risk of his life, but has little hope of making the people believe his story. No man knows his history. That's going to do it for our episode today. I just wanted to wish everybody a happy anniversary. What anniversary, do you ask? Well, we decided on this fantastic 175th anniversary of a very important day to celebrate it by a foray into the criminal empire of Nauvoo, orchestrated and run by Joseph Smith. What's this important day that we are celebrating the 175th anniversary of? Joseph Smith's assassination. That's right, 175 years ago to the day, June 27th, 1844. Now, 5 o'clock p.m., just after 5 o'clock p.m.? If you're listening at that time, hey, happy anniversary to you. It's a wonderful day, isn't it? But of course, it's also a wonderful day because we have some new patrons to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Of course, I'm a little bit behind because last week it was airing part 2 and I was on the road and didn't have an opportunity to record from Ground Gnome Studios. So we have a new pledge by Stephen, new pledge by Clint, by Michael Lecheminant. That is the coolest name. It looks French. I love it. It's an amazing last name. We also have a pledge edit by Chris, a new pledge by Mark, a pledge edit by Levi, and another pledge edit by Andrea. So to all of our new patrons, as well as those who edited their pledges, thanks for pledging to support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism and for continuing to support the show for those of you who did edit your pledges. And of course, I want to express a huge thank you to all of our patrons, to all the patrons who've been around for a long time or for just a very short amount of time, to our newest patrons, of course. Thank you all so much for supporting this research endeavor. And of course, my way of saying thank you to supporting the show is by providing you with a whole bunch of extra content. Not only do you get an extra episode every week, but you also get my ending variety show after the regular episode. So if you are a Patreon subscriber, be sure to subscribe to the actual Patreon exclusive feed because you get an extended edition of every new episode. And that's a variety show where, I'm just going to say it's uncensored. So if you like the older episodes where I was, ranting and raving a little bit here and there, maybe using some uncouth language, as some may call it, you know what? The patrons feed is going to be where you want to check out the show. Of course, I also wanted to announce that I was recently on the Godless Engineer YouTube show. This is an episode you're going to find linked up in the show notes, but basically I was invited on to Godless Engineer with another ex-Mormon. Godless Engineer is not an ex-Mormon, just an atheist who's read David Fitzgerald's book, The Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion, the book 1, The Mormons, and he was able to have us on to dismantle a Saints Unscripted video that was 5 minutes long about Joseph Smith being convicted of fraud. And it was a lot of fun. So once again, you're going to find that in the show notes. It was, I think, a little bit over an hour and a half, hour, 15 minutes, hour and a half. And it was a really fun interview. And I, of course, want to thank Godless Engineer for inviting me on to the show. It's a connection I've been trying to make for a long time. And it was really a lot of fun to hang out with him as well as with Drew. So with that, we're going to go ahead and shut it down for the evening. Of course, I want to thank all of the people who contact the show, nakedmormonism@gmail.com, or who share it on social media. Word of mouth is a great way to increase visibility of the show. And of course, if you are unable to support the show financially, at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, it helps a ton to leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcasting app of choice, especially on iTunes. Especially iTunes. That's where the most visibility comes in. But of course, that's going to do it for today, and most importantly, I want to thank every single one of you who hit that download button and who are listening all the way through the outro. Thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.